Role, I travelled all over the world to some very interesting and very remote areas. And by absolutely no planning whatsoever, I became an early adopter in sustainable business practice and a bit of an expert in running industrial programs, drilling oil and gas wells in very fragile ecosystems. So I was engaging in some of the real challenges around sustainable business practice very early on, really before the sector addressed those issues as a critical business risk at all. Once I'd done my time in exploration with BP, I started to look at other opportunities, and in fact I joined a much smaller oil company and then almost instantaneously was seconded back to a very big oil company and ended up working with ENR Agip in Italy, where I had a terrific opportunity to lead on their first sustainability-driven exploration program, which as a direct result, they became sector leader on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which I'm sure all of our listeners are aware. It's used by investors on making major funding decisions. As you say, somewhat poacher turned gamekeeper. I have subsequently worked in an advisory capacity for a long time now, supporting clients across sectors. So natural resources is a real focus for me because of my background, but I also work with businesses in food, construction, and the financial sector, really building engagement in this space and developing sustainability-driven strategies for the long-term understanding of climate-related risk and opportunity. I've just put my biography up there. More recently, from 2015 to 2018, I was a director at CDP, formerly known as the Climate Disclosure Project. It's the leading global climate disclosure NGO. It was established almost 20 years ago, specifically to address the knowledge gap of the financial impact of climate change, and very much investor-driven. In that role, I created and ran the Global Engagement Programme, supporting and advising the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, which you mentioned, James, and which we will be spending some time on in this webinar, launched in 2015 by Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England and head of the FSB, and chaired by Michael Bloomberg. I also advise the UN Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative and the UK Green Finance Strategy. And I spent a lot of time with businesses looking at sustainable practice, strategic thinking and risk management across sectors and geographies. I'm currently very focused on supporting business in adopting the TCFD disclosure framework to drive low carbon economies and to take the world nearer to achieving the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, I've set up this webinar today around a series of questions which I think will hopefully help to clarify the narrative. So my first question to myself is, what has driven this call for disclosure of climate information from businesses? And I think we only need to look at the evidence around us. The empirical evidence is, staring us in the face. The world is changing, and very fast. This year already, we've had record and life-threatening floods in the UK after one of the wettest winters ever recorded. This month alone, 2 major storms in quick succession. In Australia, the devastating fires have destroyed property to the value of over $100 billion and more than 1 million animals killed. Most up-to-date research on that estimates the total damage and economic loss caused by the Australian wildfires from last September 2019 into this year will be $110 billion and rising, based on an analysis incorporating methods evaluating all direct and indirect impacts of the fires from a variety of sources. This includes damage to homes and businesses, as well as their contents and cars, job and wage losses, farm and crop losses, infrastructure damage, auxiliary business losses, school closures, the costs of power outages to businesses and individuals, and the destruction of wildlife. The estimate also accounts for economic losses because of highway closures, evacuations, increased insurance premiums, which is hugely significant throughout the affected areas, as well as the reduced value of real estate across the country. The homes of over 25 million people have been affected. The firefighting costs, the flight cancellations, the delays, and the current and long-term residual health effects. The list is absolutely huge. A warming world has more energy in the system, and that manifests itself in much bigger and more destructive storm systems and dramatically heightened temperature spikes. And just dwelling on that issue of temperature spikes for a moment, there is a key global indicator on this. It's actually a huge glacier in Antarctica called the Thwaites Glacier. Since the end of 2018, there's been a program of collaboration between British and US scientists, a £20 million project to examine this major ice feature in West Antarctica. It drains an area about the size of the UK. The serious collapse of this glacier could begin within the next few decades on some models. Understanding the likely timing should help researchers predict the future sea level rises under global warming. The Thwaites Glacier alone is thought to have accounted for about 4% of global sea level rises, doubling its contribution since the mid-1990s. It's actually hit the headlines again only in the last week, and that's why I've brought it into this webinar, in that the melt has increased more rapidly than predicted. It's summer in Antarctica at the moment, so the scientists are on the ice right now. It's becoming known as the Doomsday Glacier. It could create sea level rise of virtually a metre globally by mid-century, by 2050, on worst case scenarios. That means inundation of some of our key global cities. And last summer was one of the hottest on record. The hottest years ever recorded have been in the last 5 years. Last summer, on the 1st of August, the Greenland ice sheet broke all previous records by losing more water volume in one day than on any other day since records began in the middle of the last century in 1950, shedding 12.5 billion tonnes of water in a 24-hour period. The record-breaking day came during a week-long extreme melt event, hitting Greenland due to soaring temperatures and low snow accumulation over the preceding winter. The warmer temperatures were part of a heat wave that scorched Europe in late July last year, setting records in several countries, including Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Moving to this January at Davos, at the World Economic Forum annual meeting, the top 5 global risks are now all climate related. Climate has been in the top 5 for the last 5 to 10 years, normally taking sort of 2 of the top 5 slots, or last year it took 3. This year, all 5 are climate related. And the insurance giant AXA has announced a quadrupling of its 2020 green investment target, from just over $3.5 billion to over $14 billion, as the company's CEO warned that 4 degrees Celsius of warming this century, which, by the way, if we don't hit the targets of Paris and do something radical about reducing our emissions budget, we're on a trajectory to hit over 3.5 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels before the end of this century. So this is a statement based on fact and the evidence to date. And what he said was that would make the world uninsurable. So with all of this swirling around us, the imperative to understand how climate change will potentially affect business seems clear in terms of potential loss of value. Start to extrapolate how the effect of climate change will seriously impact the bottom line in the sectors driving our economies: energy production and distribution, transport, water, global supply chains, and see where that gets our thinking. Climate change is indisputably recognised now as the defining issue of our age. This chart actually is from NASA, which is one of my favourite data sources, and actually shows emissions and data in real time. You can see with this extraordinary spike at the right-hand side of the curve what's happened since 1950. So this goes back over 800,000 years. And actually, in many climate discussions, you'll see a classic hockey stick curve where you look at the last 100 years and you see a growth in carbon emissions where you're sort of flatlining up until about 1950, 1960, and then suddenly there's that exponential growth in that sort of hockey stick curve up to the present day. I think this actually is a really fantastic and obviously more dramatic demonstration where you've got virtually a vertical line from 1950 to the current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But looking back, pre-1950, it never went above that point in the graph. So I think it's a very powerful visual demonstration of where we are today. And we have to make progress. The 2020s is the decade when we need to make a significant difference to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if the goal of the Paris Agreement to keep mean global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade is to be achieved. Increasingly, governments are setting net zero targets, and businesses and other organisations are under pressure to play their part and to demonstrate to investors, to customers and to other stakeholders the steps they're taking to address this critical issue. And to understand if we're getting anywhere near hitting those targets, there has to be an accepted system of measuring emissions and disclosing that information publicly. So we've already referred to it a few times. My next question to myself is, what is the TCFD? And I'd like to go back in time to September 2015, so a few months before the Paris Agreement and COP21, which took place in December of 2015. Back in the September of that year, one of the world's most mainstream financial heavyweights, Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England and head of the G20's Financial Stability Board, hammered home this message to the annual Lloyd's of London dinner, and therefore to the global insurance industry. He said, "Climate change is the tragedy of the horizon. We don't need an army of actuaries to tell us that the catastrophic impacts of climate change will be felt beyond the traditional horizons of most actors, imposing a cost on future generations that the current generation has no direct incentive to fix." Which, apart from being an incredibly powerful message, clearly points out this is completely contrary to what sustainable development actually means. Incidentally, I'm sure you know this, but I really think it's worth emphasising. The Financial Stability Board was created as a direct result of the global financial crash of 2007-08, which resulted in a recession we're still experiencing some of the repercussions from. And it was set up to develop a framework for financial institutions to ensure that this never happened again. Mr. Carney also said in this speech to Lloyd's of London that if the world thought the crash of 2008 was difficult, it would look like a walk in the park compared to what would hit us if nothing was done to address the financial implications of climate change. So, in Paris in December of that year, alongside the signing of the Paris Climate Accord, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was launched, the TCFD, with a membership of 32 global businesses to address how climate risk could effectively be disclosed in mainstream financial filings, encouraging investment away from high carbon emitting businesses and thus driving the global energy transition. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, was mandated by the G20's Financial Stability Board and developed the framework for companies to ensure that their climate-related risks and opportunities are being properly assessed, measured, and incorporated into key business drivers, governance, risk management, and business strategy processes, and to inform investors and other stakeholders about how the company is managing and mitigating these risks, but also seeking to benefit from any potential opportunities. And I want to highlight this statement in the lower left-hand side of the slide. It's not about what your business does to the climate, it's what the climate could do to your business. This is a really, in effect, this is the opposite viewpoint to the way businesses have historically viewed climate and carbon emissions. Businesses have for a very long time thought about impact on the environment, on carbon footprinting. They have, in many cases, adopted some absolutely fantastic initiatives. They've developed amazing CSR, corporate social responsibility strategies, and they've looked at carbon footprinting, and what are we doing to the environment? What's our effect? This is making businesses really think in a very different way. And it's quite chilling with some boards of companies. When I've sat with them and I've just put that statement out there, I've actually seen the colour drain out of some faces. This is a very different proposal. So there are four key themes, four key pillars supporting the TCFD approach. The methodology is built on these four areas of focus. Governance, which wraps around, I think it's actually quite a good little diagram there, and it's the visual image the TCFD adopted very early on, because it's a bit like, you can imagine it like an onion with the onion skin in ever decreasing layers around it. And the whole thing is wrapped around by governance. It absolutely has to start with what the board is doing, what the board is saying, and where responsibility lies. So governance, defining board and management roles. The question, how is climate change factored into your business and strategic decisions, into your risk management, your budgeting, your performance, your capital expenditure, and your divestment? Key question for boards. Then down to the strategy level, looking at impacts, response, and resilience. Risk management. Businesses already have very sophisticated risk management methodologies. Climate has to then go into that part of their business. It has to be process driven. It fits in the risk register. There is risk ownership. And then really down to the granular stuff, the nitty gritty, the numbers, and also developing sustainability KPIs which are appropriate to a particular business. The framework, known now as the TCFD recommendations, urges companies to identify the short and longer term risks and opportunities they face from climate change, to gauge the resilience of business strategy. And this point is very important. It's to gauge the resilience of business strategy under at least two possible future climate and policy scenarios, and then use this information to make a set of climate-related disclosures to investors in their mainstream reports. If you like, it's a way of looking into the future, because we can no longer use the past as the model for business going forward. Business as usual simply isn't possible anymore. It doesn't predict the future. And actually, under these four themes, there are 11 key disclosures which the TCFD report recommendations asks businesses to focus on. Two fit in under the governance theme, and then there are three under the remaining pillars: strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. These recommendations are beginning to generate some wide support. Some of the leading companies who are really leading in terms of being leaders as opposed to laggards have really demonstrated the value of this. And there are now approximately 1,000 organisations, businesses and institutions who have publicly stated that they are either already or want to align to the TCFD approach. There's been renewed impetus over the past 12 months, particularly as governments, central banks and institutional investors have ramped up demands for companies to provide this type of information as recommended by the TCFD. In the UK, the government has set the target of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And in order to do that, we have to know where those emissions are coming from and what is being done to reduce them. And clearly the disclosure of that information is a critical part of that. So I'd just like to focus on, for a moment, my next question, which is all around risk. And what are the key risks that are addressed by this approach? And the TCFD very neatly lumps risk into three buckets, if you like. They are physical risk, liability risk, and transitional risk. Now, physical risk, we've already alluded to that earlier on in this session, looking at the empirical evidence around us, rising sea levels, the increased intensity and the frequency of flooding, droughts, storms, the effect it has on infrastructure, on supply chains, on raw materials, on water availability, on working conditions, and so on. In fact, just as a slight aside here, I happen to know that the TCFD is being adopted in terms of military planning, and the military have for a very long time, for well over a decade, considered climate to be one of the key predictors of where conflict will occur. And in particular, the water stress around the world is seen as a major lever of change in terms of conflict zones. That I think is quite a significant fact in understanding how important this stuff is. Liability risk is something that businesses, and I would perhaps suggest that in terms of legal firms is rather important in terms of how businesses are viewing this methodology. And liability is across an awful lot of issues that are climate related. Let's think about carbon taxes as a starting point. Businesses in many cases are already applying a carbon price internally to their budgeting and their financial forecasting. There are new laws and regulations coming in, and they're coming in rapidly. Again, liability is a huge issue that business is beginning to have to consider climate liability as a major driver. The loss of reputation and the social license to operate is a big point in here. And of course, public protest is beginning to change the narrative and change the dynamic and really increase the pressure on businesses to demonstrate what they are doing about it. Transition issues are very, very big. So the transition to a low carbon world and the energy transition away from our traditional natural resources of power generation of coal, oil and gas and into renewables is changing the game plan very, very quickly. Oil and gas companies are looking hard at the potential of stranding of their assets, what that means for the bottom line. Tech and innovation is a major risk. Technological innovation is changing incredibly rapidly, much, much faster than was predicted a couple of years ago. And if you look at the cost of wind and solar, for example, the cost of that has absolutely plummeted in only 2 years. It has become a very cheap technology, and there are examples around the world of countries who are already leapfrogging what we might consider to be the normal progression through, for want of a better phrase, the sort of industrial revolution. Kenya, for one example, is already 98% on renewables as its power production facilities. So this is a really significant risk, transition risk. Now, one thing I think is worth thinking about, we're talking a lot about this TCFD methodology, and there have been, it's not as if we've never assessed or used a framework to assess this stuff before. In fact, prior to the TCFD, there were in excess of over 400 ways of doing this, frameworks and methodologies in existence, being used by businesses around the world to demonstrate what their process was in terms of assessing climate and carbon related business. And I think it's worth pointing out that actually this was one of the major topics of conversation in the very early meetings of the TCFD was, so there's all this stuff out there already. Why? What are we doing about it? And how can we step back from that? Because by having all these different ways of assessment and methodological approach, businesses basically could just pick the one they liked. If that one suits me and that one sends out a message that, ticks my boxes and frankly makes us look good in terms of viewed through the lens of our approach to climate change, we're going to go for it. What it didn't do was provide anything like a consistent or clear or reliable approach to make decisions upon. So for investors, the key question was, where's the decision useful information? Where can we actually make comparisons, even within businesses in one sector? And actually what the TCFD approach has done is to develop not just clarity, consistency and comparability within sectors, but across sectors. So you have this globally accepted way of disclosing this information for decision useful investment houses to be able to decide where the money goes and where it doesn't go. And I think if I just go back actually to the four key themes, one of the major differentiators of the TCFD approach comes under the strategy heading. I mentioned that there are 11 main disclosures that the TCFD process asks businesses and institutions to provide, 2 under governance and 3 under each of the rest. Under strategy, the key differentiator is the requirement to use scenario analysis. And scenario analysis is a way of stress testing your business against a future way of the world, if you like. What it actually says in the TCFD requirement itself is that you are required to describe the resilience of the organization's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. So you are required to look at a 2-degree or lower. We know the Paris Agreement asks us for keeping the world to 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels or below. The scenario that you are required to address looks at 2 degrees or lower, and you have to have another one as well. So you have to have a minimum of 2. And this is not a new approach. I mean, especially in the oil and gas sector, we've used scenario analysis forever. I mean, frankly, as a sort of rookie, new, bright, shiny geologist, I can remember doing scenario analysis around particular exploration programs. So it's a well-established method for developing strategic plans that are more flexible and are robust to deal with a range of plausible future states. And it's giving the importance of forward-looking assessments of climate-related risk. The TCFD believes that it's such an important and useful tool for an organization to use. It assesses both the potential business implications of climate risk and opportunity. So that's the internal process. And it also informs external stakeholders about how the organization is positioning itself in light of these risks and these potential opportunities. There are a number of globally approved climate scenarios that businesses are encouraged to take into their consideration, again, so that there is consistency and reliability, and these are, if you like, objectively created. The ones that are regularly used are the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has a 1.5 degree scenario. It produced a special report on this in October 2018. It's heavily referred to and it's very, very well researched. The Bloomberg New Energies Foundation has its New Energy Outlook. It's greater than or equal to 2 degrees scenario. So there are a number of them. They're very, very well researched and they're updated every year. And I think a key issue around this is how will this contribute to driving this energy transition? And of course, the absolutely major challenge the world faces at the moment is this change from hydrocarbon-driven economies to a system based on renewables, thereby radically reducing carbon emissions. The push to decarbonize the global economy is accelerating. It's creating new uncertainties across all sectors. Global supply chains are affected, and companies are really having to confront the possibility of reduced demand, reduced pricing for their products, and increasing challenges. Reputational and societal license to operate are only part of that. And while oil and gas are assumed actually to continue to play a role in meeting the world's energy needs, even under the scenarios such as the International Energy Agency's Paris-aligned Sustainable Development Scenario, which is one of those I was referring to previously, it is nonetheless critical that all companies demonstrate to their stakeholder base, and that covers investors, shareholders, governments, regulators, and an increasingly powerful and climate-aware public, that action is being taken to drive this transformational change to low-carbon economies. The TCFD recommendations provide a globally recognised framework to do this. And this inclusion of the use of scenario analysis is effectively how to stress test your business and demonstrate the resilience of your business models. I think, again, public pressure is something that is really worth focusing on for a moment. The public narrative has changed so dramatically in the last 12 to 15 months. It is quite extraordinary. We have the Greta effect, of course, and lover or hater, this has been a very, very significant and powerful lever. I was actually in New York for the UN Climate Summit last September and New York Climate Week, which is an annual event. And always, it's always a frankly complete madness when you're there. There's it's one of those things whereby you have to, if you could possibly split yourself into 5 different people, you could be at 5 different events simultaneously, all of which are designed to demonstrate how ahead of the game a particular business is because they're hosting this event. But there was a very different feel to it this year. There was, first of all, this feeling of real urgency and the sense of reaching a tipping point, and a sense that we've done so much talking about this, but we actually have to start doing now. We have to stop talking and start doing. And then other areas of pressure, the little picture in the middle of this slide where you've got a sort of part of a statement with twice the size of Vancouver being effectively the punchline. That's actually from a major exploration of Canadian oil sands project, which has been completely stopped. 18 months ago, that would have gone ahead. The entire project has been completely stopped and not just kicked into the long grass, but totally binned. It would have taken an area of natural forestation and green cover twice the size of Vancouver away, and the numbers simply no longer add up. That has been completely abandoned. The little map of the UK is showing where, in fact, the UK is very much a leader in this space. We have a net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Scotland has gone a little bit further than that and is heading for or aiming for net zero by 2045. And then, of course, we've got Extinction Rebellion down there in the left-hand corner. And again, love them or hate them, they're making a point that politicians cannot anymore just ignore. And actually, just a little story here about the public narrative and the media coverage. Up to 18 months ago, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and I've done a number of interviews with BBC reporters and so on over the years. We used to fight tooth and nail to get onto the UK's flagship radio news programme, the Today programme. It's the radio programme all politicians listen to in the UK. It changes people's minds. It has a very significant effect. And any politician that says they don't listen to the Today programme, frankly, is not telling us the truth. But anyway, we used to very occasionally get the opportunity to be on the Today programme. We always got the 6:10 in the morning slot when, frankly, nobody's listening. This is to the early birds who might be up and having setting off to work early then. But we never really got beyond that point. Now we're on at 8:10 in the morning. We're on the flagship part of the programme. We have the top interviewer. This is very, very big news. And again, it's the change and the pace of change that I think is really worth emphasising. The public pressure is affecting businesses very, very significantly. And that is creating change and is creating a different way of looking at this in terms of value. I think also at this point, my next question to myself is going to be, what's the investor perspective? How are investment decisions changing? Well, global assets under management using socially responsible investing reached over $30 trillion in 2018. It's been rising since then. There are currently record inflows to investment managers engaged in SRI, in socially responsible investing strategies. Over 60% of investors in a recent poll indicated that they're either already investing in or are very seriously assessing ESG strategies, so environment, social governance strategies, and are devoting entire teams to doing so. And there was very recently, in fact, February's been quite a month for announcements. So we had BlackRock, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, the biggest investment house in the world and the world's largest asset manager, putting climate change at the heart of every investment decision. A few quotes up there from what he said on the 14th of January, actually. And this was just prior to Davos and the World Economic Forum meeting, which was why it was timed in this way. BlackRock have a fundamental reshaping of finance as a driver. Climate change is driving a profound reassessment of risk, and we anticipate a significant reallocation of capital. And for me, the really big one here is we are asking companies to publish TCFD-aligned disclosures. And then this middle of this month, BP has a new CEO, and Bernard Looney made a very significant announcement to the city, whereby they have set out to basically reinvent themselves with a zero carbon goal. And there were 10 major pathways to achieve that zero carbon, one of which is to align with and disclose according to the requirements of the TCFD. So that's in the top 10 and is seen as the effective way of getting them on this pathway. These are really significant announcements in the first part of 2020, and I think demonstrate a much wider set of conversations that are going on in businesses in every sector. In fact, last week, there was a report issued by Mazars. It's worth a look. Google it, you'll find it. It's a new survey from Mazars and the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum. And I've picked out a couple of statements that are set out there. Most central banks and regulators now see climate change as a major threat to financial stability. This takes us back to Mark Carney in 2015 and the tragedy of the horizons and the threat to financial stability. And it also says in that report that across the world, financial institutions and investors should expect ever tougher regulatory action on climate change. So all of this is just reinforcing the message. I'd also like to just highlight the policy side. Will that change in terms of reporting requirements? Well, the short answer is yes. Enhanced ESG disclosures, as I've said, there are around 1,000 companies committed to TCFD reporting at the moment. But at the moment, that is a voluntary set of recommendations. No one is being required. There is an expectation and there is pressure, but this is a voluntary set of recommendations and a voluntary framework. Sustainable finance, global policy priority to encourage financial flows into sustainable activities can be seen in various parts of the world. There's the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, establishing the China's green financial system. The UN Environment Programme on redesigning the financial system has been in process for a number of years and is supported by the London School of Economics, for example, and does a huge amount of work in actually modelling what that means for the global financial system. But coming back to this issue of will this change? As I say, at the moment, TCFD is a voluntary requirement. Well, yes, it will change. The UK government has announced that all listed companies and large asset owners will be required as a mandatory requirement to disclose in line with the TCFD recommendations by 2022. So that's a 2-year time span. And I think, again, I've been really proposing this in the way I've put the case as a very good thing. I suppose being devil's advocate to myself just for a moment, there is a question here, which I'm pretty sure somebody will ask. If it's so good, why isn't everybody adopting it? It's been around since 2015, at least as an actual framework. It's been in the public domain since 2017, but as a proposal and as an initiative and as a publicly accessible information source since it was launched at COP21. Now, I have a number of answers to the question of why isn't everyone adopting it. And the main answer to that is it is voluntary at the moment. And no matter how perhaps obvious it is that we should go down this route, there will always be laggards. It doesn't matter what we're talking about in terms of business. There will always be organisations that simply will not do something until they have to. Laggards will always be with us. However, I do think that many businesses are really beginning to look at this and actually see it as the right way forward and want to do it. But there are barriers, and it isn't easy to move into this in a sort of systematic, carefully managed approach if you've never done it before. Companies have their own well-established and long-standing disclosure dynamics and processes. Those are very hard to change. There's also an issue, I think, of internal engagement and understanding. And I've worked with businesses many, many times where the route to success in terms of external reporting starts with internal engagement. I'm working with an oil and gas super major right now on exactly that issue. And it can be hard to see this as a business critical requirement now. It can still be viewed as one of those sort of bolt-on things. I mean, doesn't this fit in with our sustainability people? I mean, they're great. They've been with us a long time. They produce a great sustainability report every year. Well, no, the TCFD approach specifically is designed to bring this out of sustainability teams and right into the mainstream, reporting this stuff in your mainstream financial filings every year for investment decisions. So that is really important, and it's hard. This isn't easy to make this process change. Also, the reputational stakes are very high. Nobody wants to get this wrong and say something which they can then be, held up against them. The sort of opportunity to make mistakes and lose reputation, which has taken many, many years to build, is extreme, and businesses can lose an awful lot of real value due to reputational damage. So I think they need some help to navigate through this system, and it can appear to be a mountain to climb. This can seem to be an absolutely huge challenge, but I regularly reassure businesses that yes, it's a mountain, but you don't have to climb the mountain in one go. You can do this in a number of iterations. It takes a while to get there, and actually to become fully TCFD aligned, and the TCFD itself strongly supports this view. It's an iterative process. It can take a number of reporting cycles. So that might be over 3 or 4 years. A business I've been working with very recently has gone through its very first ever TCFD iteration. It will be reporting in its mainstream financial filings in spring of this year, but it's nowhere near fully aligned, and makes that statement, and actually makes a positive out of that statement. So I think the key is companies have to get started. And again, there is this, and I think this sits with boards actually. If it's not perfect, we're not going to do it. And actually, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You've just got to start. You've got to kind of get going on it. And once you do that, that kind of breaks down the fear barrier. So I sort of feel I'm getting to a point where there's a question about what happens next, which really is my sort of last question to myself. How will this develop? And I suppose the real big one is, can we hit the goals of the Paris Agreement? And I think that's something that, I'm a really positive person. I'm a sort of glass half full sort of person. But we are reaching a point where we have very, very little time to do this. We've been talking about it for quite a long time. We have reached a tipping point. We need to really get on with this now. And I think that has been recognised. What we cannot afford, though, is panic, because the classic reaction to very significant stress, huge challenge, and what is actually a massive existential threat is to either panic and run around in circles and do nothing sensible, or indeed to just ignore it completely and stick our heads in the proverbial bucket of sand. That we absolutely cannot afford. And I'm going to go back to Mr. Carney, who Mark Carney has very recently, only in the last a couple of weeks ago, he made a very significant statement through a big interview he did with Reuters. And this really was something which I think is in preparation to him moving on from being governor of the Bank of England into his new role as the UN climate envoy. And he made a very important statement that business must come clean quickly on climate, which is why this webinar was entitled Time to Come Clean on Climate. And in that, he says, which in his introduction, James referred to, that every company ultimately has to have a plan for responding to the energy transition and assessing what the opportunities are and where the risks are. And we have COP26 coming up at the end of this year. We are hosting it here in the UK. It's going to be in Glasgow. This is a very, very good deadline for us to aim for, so that regulators can use it to map out exactly how we make this TCFD framework compulsory. And I think there's just one other thing I'd like to reference here. And I think I said a little while ago that February has been quite a big month for statements and interesting initiatives in this space. Last weekend, the G20 met, the finance ministers of the G20 met in the Saudi capital on Saturday and Sunday in Riyadh to discuss top global economic challenges. Of course, this includes coronavirus. This is absolutely the major risk that global economies are dealing with right now. But we know that that will ultimately go through a process and will, hopefully very quickly, but maybe a little slower. But this year we will have managed that. We will not this year have managed the threat of climate change. And the G20 statement, for the first time since President Trump became head of the USA, included a very significant set of statements on climate. I just remind you that the very first thing President Trump did after being sworn in as president was to take the USA out of the Paris Climate Accord. So the fact that last weekend at the G20, climate change gets this first mention in the Trump era is really significant. And that statement said, concerns about the economic impact of climate change have escalated in recent years. Pressure is mounting on business to accelerate the shift to a low carbon economy ahead of the UN climate talks at COP26 in November. A report issued last week forecast the world's financial services sector risks losses of up to $1 trillion if it fails to respond quickly to climate change and is hit by policy shifts, such as the introduction of a carbon tax. The IMF included climate-related disasters in a list of risks that could derail a highly fragile projected recovery in the global economy in 2020. And a final statement from the IMF chief, Kristalina Georgieva, in which she said, "We cannot hide away from what is going on. The climate crisis is upon us." So I'd like to end there. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you.
Look, that's been absolutely fantastic. Someone I think has slipped off mute, so perhaps you just all check your mutes. Someone slipped off in the last minute there. Jane, that's been absolutely fantastic and perfect as a globally relevant topic with an insight from an expert, which is exactly what we're looking for in our programme. I've had a couple of questions in, although you had a fantastic habit, as I was making notes for my questions, of answering them just as soon as I finished writing about them. And in fact, the last question I received was about, although it didn't name him, was obviously about Trump, which you helpfully dealt with in your concluding point. But I was struck that your presentation was structured actually, or bookended, I suppose, with a Carney statement in 2015 and a Carney statement in 2020. Do you think, to what extent will the progress, if we come back in 5 years, will Mark Carney be happy with the point that we've reached? Or do you think that there still needs to be greater emphasis if we're going to achieve over that sort of time frame the objectives that he set out most recently?
Well, I think it's a very good point, and it struck me when I was thinking about doing this this webinar that yes, you know, this is an individual who has made a very significant impact in how we address this challenge. I think in his role of UN climate envoy, he is still going to be an extremely significant and influential voice. And I think the point whereby the things like the statement from Larry Fink, the complete change in the way the oil and gas super majors are looking at this, and they're looking at themselves as energy companies, not oil and gas companies, in terms of their future planning, is really important. I think my answer to the question of will we have achieved what we need to achieve in 5 years' time, well, there are two parts of it. First part being, if we haven't, we are in very, very big trouble.
Deep water.
Deep water, metaphorically and literally, we will definitely be in deep water. And I think there's an understanding there. But I see the engines of change are in place. We cannot for one moment sort of step back on the pressure. And actually, I do think governments have a very big part to play. The issue of mandatory disclosure reporting, a requirement to do the right thing, with the best will in the world. And actually, businesses, I have always had this sort of personal mantra, and it's one of the reasons that I followed a business career. I dabbled in an academic career for a while, and I was a part-time lecturer for quite a while, and I very much was attracted to that world. But I've always seen business as an immense force for change and for good, because they have the heft, the scale, frankly, the budgets to make a difference. But we need the regulatory side as well. We need it really urgently, and governments have got to stop sitting on their hands. They have got to change the legal requirements and make this stuff happen. It frankly is now